Thank you, Bradley. So, I like that whole $10 million idea, right? Now I'm challenging you, because that just happened, a phone call, $10 million project. There's potential for everyone in this room to meet somebody who might actually be able to create that $10 million idea. So let's get on that. So for the last question and answer session, we're going to shake it up a little bit, because I've had some complaints that some people aren't digitally aware and don't want to do this show Gizmodo. So I've got the app on if you want to ask me questions. We're going to have 2 roaming mics for the final question session. If you want to ask something out loud to Bradley, please put your hand up and the mic will come around to you. Now, I really appreciate that you guys have not thrown rocks at me yet, and you've let me bring up things like climate change, GMO, what are we going to do? Is this the end of dairy? Should we switch to different government policies for sustainability? I'm trying to push your buttons, so thank you so much for not throwing things at me. There's also a space if you want to ask controversial questions anonymously on Show Gizmodo. You can actually just message me directly. It's private. I won't give your name away. But actually, if you want to bring up something or a statement that actually, I think we need to challenge ourselves in this room. We're at different ends of the political spectrum here, and we've got different interests. We have to think about the elephant in the room, which is actually agricultural land is worth a lot of money, right? And there's an argument we haven't talked about yet today, which is, do we want to invest in dairy, or is our interest in investing in the land? Because you've seen house prices and you see how much land is worth, and actually there's a whole different profit margin versus in this agri sector, which is about how many hectares do you own. And we're not talking about that. Again, please don't throw rocks at me. But if you want to talk about controversial stuff, you can message me privately on here and I can bring up those topics without naming who you are. But I think actually this is the right room to say, hey, these are the elephants. Are we talking about this? And making sure that we're really pushing ourselves, because we're all Kiwis and we're all New Zealanders, and the bigger goal is to make sure that this country thrives and this country becomes a place that everybody looks at, that we're proud of, that we're like, yeah, we did that. We were way ahead of the curve. We stole all these ideas from these cool people, and actually we got there way before them. That's my invested interest. I really want to see New Zealand become the global place for agri-tech, and I think we all are on the same page here. So let's push our buttons. With that, do we have any, I can't see a thing, but do we have any mics or people attached to them that might want to ask a question? Say no if we don't, and I'll start the questions. All right, I'll start the questions if I don't see anybody. So you've talked about the whole cycle, right? How many times have you been to New Zealand?
This is my second.
Okay, so you know a little bit about how we work here and what our strengths are. 10 years from now, where do you see New Zealand in the grand scheme of, like, where do you think we might excel, or based on, you know, the production or local buying and all of that? Do you see that we have a niche that we fit into?
That's a good question. So
it's obviously hard to ask a foreigner, right? Because we all have our opinions, but I think sometimes views from the outside are good.
Well, I mean, so I think there's a story to New Zealand, and I think Ian really nicely communicated this, but there's a big story to New Zealand that you know, Americans or foreigners don't necessarily know much about New Zealand, but there is sort of a story that we have in our heads of, you know, it's a fun place, it's a great place to visit. There's a lot of agriculture. Those are kind of, if you know anything about New Zealand and you're an American, that's kind of what you have in your head. I think that, you know, there's probably, you know, when you look at meat, beef, lamb production, that story is sort of communicated, but it's probably not nearly as effectively communicated as it could be. It's like a little, like, it's like, yeah, we know that that's a higher quality, but it's not like, that's what you want. That's not the story, is this is what you want. The story is, it's probably a little bit better. But I think from a taste perspective, it's a lot better and the quality is a lot higher, and that could probably be continued and be a pretty enduring advantage. So that's one place on the export side where I think not just beefing up the quality or continuing to manage the quality, but making sure that the story and the message around it is really strong. And then the other, you know, like wine, I think there's a lot of opportunities if you looked internally combining food and tourism, but I don't know the market size around that. But that's just another space that I think is, people really like vacations, and they like to eat interesting foods and have good experiences with them, and you have all of those things, and they're packaged reasonably well right now, but again, I think probably not as well to a foreign audience as they could be, and so those would be two spaces.
Sorry, I'm just getting a bunch of controversial messages. It's great. I'm trying to, okay, so you're saying tourism and eating, that sounds like the perfect combination of being on vacation while stuffing my face.
Yes.
Okay, I like that. And I'm also excited about what you said about, the fact that we'll cook differently. I don't know if you've seen, but the new pancake making robot, I was pretty stoked about that coming. And the cocktail making robot, it can make 42 cocktails in a minute. I don't know, just saying that we've got drinks coming up soon and that would be a great idea. So one of the questions that I've had through, sorry, I just have to pull this up. And it's a big question. I think actually we need to think about it as New Zealand, and it's one of those elephants in the room. Environmental impacts, right? And we know about water runoff, and we know about nitrates in the water and stuff. And I guess one thing we need to think about is if our government isn't putting out policy that restricts for sustainability, or if it suddenly does and we find ourselves within massive restrictions, do you think that you're going to see a competitive advantage for certain countries that either are really lax with sustainability, so you can make more, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So I mean, I think the biggest competitive advantage is honesty from a starting point. I mean, if you look at Volkswagen and the recent controversy with Volkswagen, people are talking about it as destroying tens of billions of dollars pretty much overnight, right? I mean, and they did. They were on a path to being the world's largest car company. They essentially were not honest about their emissions, and now people are seriously wondering, are they going to survive? If they survive, are they going to be a major car? I mean, they're decimated for that. So I think that if nothing else, the biggest competitive advantage is being really transparent, really honest. I think going forward, people will be more and more engaged with sustainability, and that's definitely important. I think easy sustainability is part of that. A lot of initiatives that I've tracked over the years have failed because there was a company that got a lot of press like 10 years ago in the United States called Good Guide. And the idea was that you could shop in the grocery store, take a photo, or enter every single purchase that you were buying into your phone, get the carbon footprint, health impacts, and 2 or 3 other metrics. But if you were to actually think about it, you would be spending like 4 hours buying groceries to really sort of enact a sustainable lifestyle. And so I think the competitive advantage, I think sustainability is one, but I think making it really clear and obvious and easy for people is probably more of an enduring advantage. And then finally, I do think that, I won't say unsustainable things have a market, but I do think that there are certain, as much as I'm a fan of in vitro meat and love that idea, I think that really well-produced artisanal meats will sustain for a while. So it's not that everything has to be 100% perfect, but if it's poorly made, not sustainable, and there's a more sustainable alternative, I don't think you're in a good competitive position.
Okay. This next question is good. Okay, so I saw you had a slide up that said that you think our next generation of kids are going to be more nutritionally savvy.
Yeah.
I'm going to challenge you on that.
Okay.
I'm going to challenge you on that for many reasons, and it goes back to this rich-poor divide that we have. In New Zealand, we actually have a real issue, I think, with inequality. I can say that because I run a charity that teaches low decile kids, some of our poorest children in New Zealand, about tech and about nutrition. And what I see is there's a cultural influence on nutrition. Actually, there's a cultural influence on the type of food that you cook and what your family cooks and that tradition within that system. We have an amazing Māori Pacific Islander community, but also we have a lot of obesity and diabetes within that. I don't think nutrition content and knowledge is well known. And so the question is,
no, go
I'll say it nicely.
Yeah.
But look, you come from San Francisco and pretty much you're just a small, rich bubble tech city. Isn't there a risk that the innovations that you're predicting and the stuff that you guys are pushing, you guys being, the Silicon Valley types, this all futurist stuff, actually is a totally skewed perception of what the future might be and what actually global world markets need?
So that's a good question. So let me think. So I mean, a few points. So one of the things that excites me, so the Edible Schoolyard project that I mentioned, it was started out in Berkeley, and you could say Berkeley's part of the tech bubble of San Francisco. But before San Francisco got totally enveloped by tech, it was known as sort of a countercultural place of kind of people who were essentially kind of going against the grain and rebellious. And my family came to San Francisco in the 60s during the Summer of Love. And so, I mean, it's a very, there's a sort of cultural difference there. But the Edible Schoolyard Project really started and was aimed at getting inner city kids who don't have experience with food, don't get a lot of nutrition, engaged with food. And it's been pretty successful. And if you actually look at obesity numbers in the US among kids, they're actually starting to turn around. So they're going from going up every year to kind of leveling out to now they're actually turning around a little bit. So there's some evidence that this is changing. It's not changing everywhere. It won't all change at the same time. And I think probably the effect is bigger when you combine urban poverty than rural poverty. And there are a lot of factors like that to look at. I think the broader sort of question about some of the Silicon Valley tech food kind of people, the folks behind Hampton Creek Food, for instance, which did that egg product video that I showed at the beginning, and have a mayonnaise substitute and a cookie substitute and a number of other kind of products that are pretty broadly available now. Their founder is a vegan, and what he says is, I'm a vegan, but my dad's from Alabama, which is, if you know the US, is one of the biggest kind of meat-eating places in the world. And what he says is, my goal is to make something that's so delicious, much cheaper, that I'm not selling my dad on the fact that it's sustainable. I'm selling my dad on the fact that this just tastes better and is cheaper and better, and then it's better for him, and it has all these other things. But what he's selling is the fact that it's cheaper and tastes better. And so I think that that's one of the things that's really shifting right now, is that some of these kind of emerging companies are realizing that in the long run, everyone wants to be good and sustainable and protective of the earth, and then in the short run, we all want a really tasty dinner, and if that involves a bacon cheeseburger, so be it. So I think what they're moving toward is figuring out how to make a value proposition that sustainability is part of it, but not the whole thing.
Okay. Do we have any verbal questions or any of the runners? Because I can't see. Can you just wave at me if you have a question? No, silence in the room, because I'll just keep talking, I will. Oh, we've got one down here. If there's a mic runner. Yeah, can you just... It's not really running. They said runners. It's a bit of a mic walker. Meanderer. Okay. Hi.
Is this working? Yeah. I think we tend to have a number of myths in New Zealand that we're in the front of the agricultural industry, that we're on the doorstep of Asia, about 12 hours flight from Beijing, the same as anywhere else in the world, etc. And this looking up to Coca-Cola as a model company, for instance, and it destroys our health. It should be banned. Instead, we get front page articles about milk producers charging too much. My question is, shouldn't we be going back to basics? Butter, meat, etc., not tampering with food?
So I think that's, to me, there's a broader point that you're making, which is I think that, so I would say at a planetary level, if we want to feed everyone, I don't think that's realistic. I think the numbers aren't there. And so for me, if I were to pick a prevailing big issue in food that I care about, it's global hunger. And so I think we need to experiment beyond what we're doing if we're going to solve global hunger. So for me, I'd say I don't think that's the solution. I think there's a broader question, though, or a broader point that I do want to elevate, which is that what you're raising is how value-laden food is and how much it will always be value-laden. And so when we have these kinds of conversations, it's important to look at the science and the technology and what's happening, but that people also want sort of a feel of naturalness and back to basics and that kind of thing, and it's very understandable. And in many ways, that's what I want for my personal diet, but I also just have this sort of broader viewpoint that I don't think that's realistic for the world. But I think it's a good question. I think it's a very good, I think it's totally reasonable, and it's just, I don't think it's necessarily realistic.
Brad, Ian Proudfoot this morning made the proposition that in actual fact the world's we wanted to sell to the world's wealthy few people. Do you think that the third world could take up some of the technology you're talking about and some of the behaviours you're talking about quicker than the first world, and therefore does that actually disrupt Ian's proposition that it's only the wealthy that we want to sell our food to?
That's a good point. So I would say that really supports Ian's argument. I mean, if you look at mobile phone adoption, places like Kenya were doing things that, with mobile money and mobile payments in 2005 that were like now getting into Apple and Samsung products in Europe and the US today. So I think that, I definitely think there's going to be a lot of leapfrog innovation where the systems aren't built out in rural parts of the world. And rather than build the old systems, you'll build the new systems, which may be cheaper or not necessarily any more expensive, and in the long run, much better investment. So I think that's a really, really good observation. I'd say it probably supports Ian's argument that at least some part of what you should be thinking about is high value to high-end consumers rather than necessarily, given the position of New Zealand, feeding everyone.
Yeah, Brad, at the start you talked about linking companies together and being able to, I guess, join the dots, if you like.
Yeah.
And that's where your sort of experience really is. I think there's probably a massive opportunity for more collaboration and work within New Zealand companies to probably compete less amongst themselves and really target the global market. What in your experiences could you share to sort of help that path for New Zealand companies?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So, I mean, a few things. So one, I think it's a really good observation. And one of the things that's so nice about an event like this is that often the barriers to collaboration, but particularly between different organizations, but even within the same organization, is person A is working on the thing and person B is working basically on the same thing, and they don't actually know that the other one exists, and there's that kind of thing. So I think one thing is just the ability to get together stakeholders across fields, across industries. You can see so many more connections when you're having a sort of multi-stakeholder conversation than you can see when you're talking to the same team you always work with. So I think just continuing that kind of dynamic. The other big lesson I just would continue to emphasize is start small. A lot of the food companies I work with have some big, they have a big idea. It takes millions of dollars to roll out. If the thing doesn't work, it ruins your career. So that's not necessarily the best project to be on, but it's really, really high risk. And then if it doesn't work, even if it was pretty close to what you should have done, it becomes toxic, and then nobody wants to put resources against it. So particularly if I were thinking about, if I were sort of in your shoes, and like, how can I start to collaborate with some of the other people around here? I would do things that were low cost. I would things that don't require a lot of effort, and sort of start building up small successes that point toward a bigger opportunity. Because if you start by attacking the whole big opportunity with one really big idea, if you're wrong, and you're often wrong, then you're in big trouble. So I think that's kind of the approach I would say, is find ways to start collaborating easily, quickly, low cost, that can really sort of start to build relationships and value.
Okay, sadly we're out of time. Thank you so much for the questions, and if we could thank Bradley again.